Buongiorno a tutti e buon pomeriggio per chi segue dall'Italia. So welcome everyone and good morning. Well, it's noon, it's right noon. So thank you for taking a break from work for following this first webinar of a series of 3 that we have organized in collaboration with the Bocconi alumni community, the Toronto chapter. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Francesco Daveri with us today for this first lecture about the world after COVID-19, so perspective about the economic perspective about the situation after. And we all look forward for this after to become a reality after COVID-19. As you know, the Istituto and the Toronto chapter of the Bocconi alumni community has been collaborating since the past 3 years. We had the opportunity to organize several events, several meetings with local managers or Bocconi alumni, and to create opportunity for networking. So in a conversation not long ago with Paola Flores, who is the head of the chapter in Toronto, we decided not to give up and to take the opportunity, and on the contrary, to take the opportunity to enlarge our not only our audience, but also the floor for the panelists that we could have invited. And so Paola was, as usually, extremely efficient in creating a fantastic, and in leveraging this connection with Bocconi and getting on board the speakers. And we have this fantastic opportunity today to start the series that will continue in June. To start it today with Professor Francesco Daveri, who is Professor of Macroeconomics and Director of the SDA Bocconi MBA program. And Francesco Daveri is collaborating with several Italian newspapers, including Corriere della Sera, has been publishing and writing extensively on different economic topics, including economics in the developing countries, and has been for the past 5 years the managing editor of lavoce.info, which is one of the most credited and respected Italian online publication on economy. So with no further ado, and I thank again Professor Francesco Daveri, and I will give now the floor to Paola Flores, head of the Toronto chapter of the Bocconi alumni community. So thank you again to all the participants. Thank you, Paola.
Thank you, Alessandro. So just a very short welcome from me to all the Bocconi alumni connected. We have our alumni today from Canada, but also North America and Latin America, that we also wanted to welcome and thank for participating the friends from the Istituto Italiano di Cultura, and as well as some Italian friends, and of course the other European schools, business schools that are always attending our events. So today we have the great honor to have Professor Francesco Daveri with us, and it's a different event for us, it's a digital one. So don't wait up to the end to ask questions, but use the Q&A session that you see on the video, because we wanted to make this session as much interactive as possible. So again, thanks Francesco to be with us. Francesco is Professor of Macroeconomics in Bocconi and the Director of the MBA. So thanks to be with us. So before you start officially, I would like to ask you how you manage this lockdown in Italy. We are all confined in Canada, you know. So we are curious to know how you manage it in Bocconi in particular. What did you transform? What did you change there that maybe we can learn for the future?
Okay, so first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be with you, although from a distance. There might be a time in which this will not be from a distance and maybe physically there, so I would be looking forward to it. For now, however, here I am. I will not be speaking about Italy because this would be the object of a seminar in itself, I think. So therefore, I will skip this, and instead I will concentrate on what I personally did. Even Bocconi would actually be a much a bigger topic than the one that I can usefully cover with you right now. I'm in charge of running one of the School of Management programs, perhaps the one that is considered to be the flagship program from the school, so the Full-Time MBA. Our Full-Time MBA was certainly not very well known for making a lot of considerable use of new technologies before COVID-19. We were very much so that the hallmark of our program was come over here and find a cozy program with people interacting with you all the time. I know, and that's actually true, I know the names of my students, all the names of my 92 students of this year, just because they are 92 and not 920 or bigger numbers, which is what you find elsewhere. So therefore, we were known for our coziness, and all of a sudden, on February the 22nd, this coziness appeared to be destroyed from something unexpected and unknown, moreover, in its duration, in entity. So everything became very, very fuzzy for, I think, for everybody else. But certainly Italy has been the first Western country where we had to face this issue. And so I had to take this decision, and it was taken essentially in 15 minutes on the Sunday, 24th of February, when I decided to go online with the program. And I discovered that we had a technological platform in place, Blackboard, perfectly functioning, which we somehow underutilized, maybe 90% underutilization, that was the ratio. And so therefore we discovered that the platform was there, that the staff, in order to assist us in moving to the, in adopting a better technology, was actually there and ready to work with us. I would say that about 1/2 of the staff, of the teaching staff, was ready to go. Fortunately, the one already best in the best position to move online were also the ones in charge of teaching for the next Monday. So therefore, that good luck plays a role, obviously, as for everything. So therefore, essentially, I went online. We went online with the program for the Monday. And then I started asking myself, I evaluated how the experiment was at the end of the morning of Monday, and then we moved to Tuesday. And then after Tuesday, Wednesday came, and then Thursday, and then Friday, and then we started planning for the future. But at the time, at least, it was not clear when this would have continued, for how long this would have continued. So we kept having quite a bit of interaction with the students in order to make them knowledgeable about how things were going. And so therefore, I kept going with this week after week announcement, in also somehow, not somehow, strictly in line with the safety rules and the other regulations adopted by the Italian government and by the city council in Milan and by Bocconi itself. So therefore, that's how we went. It was a very interesting. I mean, being a macroeconomist, I'm not known to be a person. We as a category, we are not known to be persons able to solve problems. We typically pinpoint problems where the problems are, and then we leave somebody else to fix the problem. In this case, I didn't have anybody else to delegate, so therefore I was in charge. I have some colleagues of mine who teach change management. I don't know how to teach change management, but I know how to do change management now, because then I learned along the way. It was a very exciting experience in itself. Students suffered a little bit with me There was no such a thing like Saturday and Sundays, working week. Has been cancelled, the distinction. So we kept working together in order to make the program go. And somehow the program kept going. We had to adapt, to make some adaptation. Just to give you an example, we have Michael Spence, who's a Nobel Prize in Economics, was supposed to give a course at the beginning of March. We decided to postpone Mike's course to the next fall, when students are back to campus, just because the other professors, you can see them from a distance, but maybe it's the only chance that you have as a student to see a Nobel Prize in person. So we wanted to have the Nobel Prize in person when the time comes, and this will be in the second week of October. So we postponed. That's the only course that we postponed to the fall. The other courses essentially went along as planned, with adjustments as obvious. Okay, but I'm not here to tell you about, I don't want to make it too long, but I think it was an interesting, it was a very interesting experience, very challenging, very exciting, and it made me feel very much close to my students, in a strange way, because essentially they were there before, but they would rarely come to my office when it was possible. Because you never go to see the director unless you have a problem. It was like in school. So well, instead, when the director is far away, then and this applies to me as well. So I essentially understood that it was very important for me to give them the perception that I was with them, and they realized this. And I think this was an important element, an important glue for the people to stay attached to the program and to improve their user experience. For the future, we will keep complementing online techniques with physical learning. So we will continue to be a cozy program, but then with better technology being used from time to time from now onwards.
Just I see that we already have, yeah.
Yeah, okay. My question, do you expect more insourcing of manufacturing in Italy to create a stronger domestic supply chain based on the impact of COVID-19? I assume that closed borders and shutdown of foreign plants created issues to receive components. Jason, thanks. My answer is yes to the first. There's more than one question, I would say. Then the answer is yes, I expect to see, and we do see something already in place in terms of shortening of the supply chains. In terms of, we see less of global supply. Perhaps Italy was less involved than other countries, take Germany for instance, in distributing segments of production all over the place. What we did was to delocalize production maybe to Romania, maybe to Eastern Europe mostly, rather than China and other parts of the world. So what I expect to see is a regionalization of supply chains. So in case Della Valle wants to sell Tod's shoes to China, then he would still produce things in China, and instead he would concentrate more production for the European market in Europe, and then production for the US market in the US. So this would simplify the handling of these productions rather than having them spread around. Although Italy, I think, was less involved than other countries in this type of business compared to before. I'm not sure whether consumers would be ready to pay more to fund domestic production of goods. This will be, I think, the object of, we will see how competition will play a role in this respect, whether this will be on the shoulders of producers or will be somehow, so the bill will be footed by consumers instead. Well, based, I guess in the close future, less distant future, consumers' pockets will be perhaps a little bit more empty than maybe in 1 year or 2 years from now. So therefore, it's more likely for me that prices will be kept flat or even lower than they were for the foreseeable future, and then for the future we will see. In any case, the remaining feature is that I expect to see these regional supply chains to become commonplace in even for other countries, not simply for Italy. Okay, so I would start my presentation at that point, although I really welcome questions like this. I'll try to share my screen. Let's see whether I can make it. And then, yes, to press F5 in order to make... oh, it's there. I jumped too fast. So generally speaking, I would like to speak about how the world economy is doing in terms of recession and recovery under COVID-19. So not concentrating my attention specifically on Italy, but rather trying to give you a broader perspective. I know that there are people connected, obviously apart from Canada, but also from South America, so therefore I included some data also for Brazil. Perhaps a good starting point that we forgot already is how the world was some 6 months ago or 5 months ago. This is a picture taken from the website of the International Monetary Fund, and this was January 2020. Looks like the Stone Age in terms of a distance compared to what we are seeing now. The picture at the time was that the global economy was expected to be on a path of gradual recovery from 2019, which was seen to be a slow growth year. 2019 has been the time in which the US-China tariff war had effects and negative effects on growth. And this explains why the world economy grew by a bare 2.9 percentage point compared to 2018. This was lower than the average long-run growth rate of the world economy, which in the last 40 years or so has fluctuated a little bit, but on average it has stayed close to 3.4% per year. Starting from the mid-70s, so since the time in which the IMF started calculating these data. So what you see from this table is that the global economy was expected, growth in the global economy was expected to pick up in 2020 and 2021, essentially going back to the long-run growth rate of GDP for the world economy. And this acceleration was actually expected to come from emerging markets and other developing economies, while instead growth in advanced economies would stay roughly constant, somehow in between 1.5 and 2 percentage points. But this was the Stone Age. Then we have the data for today, and here you have the sudden change that occurred with the virus. This is summarized in the table that you see on your right-hand side. And these include the latest World Economic Outlook growth projections taken from April 2020. The IMF is publishing every 3 months its updates for growth in the future. And here you have data for 2020 and 2021. And you do see immediately that there has been a sudden change with the virus. What is this sudden change? Well, the sudden change is comes in 2 pieces. The first piece has to do with 2020. 2020 will, in 2020, we will record what the IMF has called the worst recession since the 1930s, since the 30s. World GDP will do a -3%, which compares with the plus 3.4% that I mentioned before. So essentially, the missing growth is not simply the -3, it's -6.4 percentage point compared to the normal. This is much worse than in 2009. Just to remember, in 2009, GDP growth has been essentially zero. This was the year after Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. And what we are having is that this -3 will be essentially the result of a -6% for advanced economies, which normally grows, just to take round numbers, by 2%. And this comes from a -6 for the US, Canada, and the UK, and a -7.5% for the euro area. In turn, within the euro area, you have countries doing better and countries doing worse than this average, with Italy and Spain doing worse, and Germany and France doing better than this. So somehow Germany will be growing in negative numbers, not too far away from the numbers that you see for the United States, Canada, and the UK. Well, instead, Italy would be doing -9. At least in this setting that the IMF is writing down there. Emerging economies will be faring better in relative terms compared to advanced economies, but the -1 for emerging economies compared to a normal of +5. So the shortfall in terms of growth is quite substantial even for emerging economies. In turn, when thinking of emerging economies, there's one point to be made, which is the BRIC split. So we have the China and India will grow anyway, which shows some positive numbers. There's a plus sign there, with China and India faring around 1 or 2%, 1% for China, around 2% for India. Well, instead, Brazil, Russia, and the other primary resource exporting countries will witness growth rates close to -5% or even less than that. So therefore, there's a big difference within the BRIC, but once again, this difference between the BR and the IC of the acronym was there even from before. So somehow China and India has been growing by some 6% or so in the past few years as well. Well, instead, in Brazil and Russia and other raw material exporting countries, growth has always been fluctuating around an average of 2%, but often going very negative or much more positive than this. So this is 2020, and then we have the 2021 rebound, which is there in the data. And these data there tend to show what we see as a very positive number for 2021, plus 5.8%, which is somehow similar to the bouncing back to growth that was observed in 2010 after the horrible 2009 years. And this will be the result of a bouncing back of advanced countries and emerging markets to something like 5% and 6.5%. So this is the big picture. So we see a major recession in 2020, but then a relatively quick bouncing back of growth in 2021. There's, however, a big question mark, or a big if. The big if is that, as the chief economist of the IMF, Gita Gopinath, was mentioning, unusually, there's always uncertainty, obviously, concerning future growth, but never like this for this term and for this World Economic Outlook numbers. The numbers in the table hinge on two very crucial assumptions that I want to highlight. The first assumption is the numbers that you see in the table are calculated under assumption 1. The health emergency due to COVID-19 ends in the second quarter of 2020, period. Second, there's no second wave in 2021. Next question is, what if 1 goes wrong or 2 goes wrong? What if the emergency continues? then the numbers for 2020 would be much worse. I'm simply reporting the data for the world economy just to give you a rough order of magnitude. GDP 2020 would deliver a -6, so twice as much worse than expected. And what if the second wave of the disease shows up, supposing the first few months of 2021? In this case, we would still have a -3 for 2020, because this would imply that assumption 1 has been validated. So this means that the health emergency effectively ended in this quarter that we are in which we are now. And then we don't have, but then if we have a second wave in 2021, then the recovery would be much less pronounced than what is being assumed by the IMF economists as a central, let's say, momentum, a central story that they are telling in their report. Then it could be that the two things come together, but just to wish ourselves good luck, I'm not reporting the numbers in case we have that the emergency continues and the second wave shows up, because then numbers would be even worse than what we have seen so far. But I would say that for now, it seems that the data have been evolving in a way that may be seen as relatively consistent with what we are seeing now. Now I don't, oh, we have a question from Monica. Considering what happened with SARS, they are actually foreseeing a new wave in the fall of COVID-19. We will learn this. Yes, thank you. It could be, there are, I'm not sure that there is a projection like this. I see that the virologists and other experts are discussing in case we have a return of the second wave of contagions, then we should see worse numbers than this. However, even with the return of the contagion, the importance difference that I see compared to what we have seen before is that we will be wearing masks, we will be adopting more of distancing compared to what was in the past. So therefore, I'm not saying that I'm relatively optimistic, even in the case in which something materializes, but then I expect that this will make a difference. So, but I would spend some time in discussing these issues in the final part of my presentation. So, if you don't mind, I would postpone discussion of the what if to the final part of my presentation. Then we do have that, yes, there might be the new Cold War between China and the US will materialize again, and then so this means that there will be an even worse scenario compared to what we are seeing now. But yes, I'm seeing Istituto Italiano di Cultura would like to answer this question. I don't know exactly what this means. Maybe let me see. I want to make it okay. If we can postpone perhaps a deeper discussion of the things you are raising. These are deep questions, so therefore I would postpone them to the end. I don't have very many slides, so therefore my suggestion is that we continue a little bit. Clearly, if you have clarification questions, then they can be handled easily along while we go. But then I suggest we keep more fundamental questions, such as the ones that you were raising now, to the end, in order so that we can sort of evaluate together in its entirety the data that I want to share with you. So having said so, in case I manage to, yes, I want to show you some other data, which includes the monthly profiles of recession and potential recoveries across countries, at least in the way in which they are summarized in one which I consider the most important snapshot that we can take for the economies, which is the so-called market composite PMI. PMI, it's not like in Italian piccole e medie imprese, it's the Purchasing Manager Index. So it's an index which is calculated in a very timely fashion by market, and this is the convenient part of this index is that it becomes available concerning the month of May. It becomes available for manufacturing on June the 1st and for services on June the 3rd. So therefore we can have a composite value for this indicator, which is a proxy for a monthly GDP, which we actually don't observe. So GDP is observed every quarter. And instead with this PMI, with this market PMI, we can see GDP every month. And moreover, we learn about GDP one day after the end of the month. So we don't have to wait like 40 days, which is the typical delay that national statistical institutes inflict on us because they have to manufacture the data and deliver reliable data. So the PMI data from market are showing, you see blue bars. They are seemingly boring. I didn't try to differentiate them because I wanted exactly to show how similar data were until February 2020. We had that essentially still in January. January was up. Let me say something for those who are not familiar with this indicator. The threshold value for the PMI is 50. When you have a 50, this means that the economy is doing zero growth in that month. However, for China, for instance, China grows by 6%. So what they are doing is that they normalize across along normal growth in countries. So therefore, zero growth doesn't have the same meaning in different countries. But what we see here is that, for generally speaking, you see that the data were very similar to 50 for most of the countries included here, including China. Then you have that in February, the PMI is very bad for China only, and not for other countries. For other countries, still have data that are not too far from 50. Then we have that March comes. March is instead bad essentially everywhere with data much lower than 50. You see 40 for the United States, in the order of 35 for Germany, 38 for the UK. Then you have China, which is instead bouncing back from the very bad numbers seen in February and bouncing back to 45 already in March. Then you have data of about 30 for the Euro area as a whole, averaging the 20 of Italy, 30 of France, 35 for Germany. Then you have 38 for the UK. You have 45 for Canada, and you have something like between 35 and 40 for Brazil. So you do see that for March, so for February, the data were similar, but then for March, instead, we have bad numbers for essentially every other country but China, which is instead showing the green shoots of recovery. April becomes the worst month everywhere, while instead China somehow goes towards completing its stabilization towards 50. While instead we have the data for May, which are still not available for China, although actually they could be available by now. We are having that data stabilized around the 50 for China. So because the reading for China services that came out today was actually very positive. while instead you see green shoots, which means negative signs becoming less severe for other countries. So the way to interpret the relatively good data, so why is May a good month? Is a good month because you see very bad numbers when you compare to 50, you see 35, 30, less than 30 for Brazil. But generally speaking, data are always better than April. That's a crucial thing. So if we want to translate these numbers in terms of what we could see for the data for GDP, it could be a very negative number for April, but it is a less negative number for May, typically comparable to what we have seen presumably for March. I'm sorry to report, speaking to our Brazilian friends, that it's probably visible from my picture here that Brazil has not really yet shown a watershed of a turnaround. We are still seeing data that are far below 30, so this means absolutely subdued growth and very negative growth rates for Brazil, even in May. Well, instead, for other countries, I'm confident that in June we will see data that are not too far from 50 for perhaps not a full-fledged completion of a turnaround, but something not too far away from 50. That's my expectation. So therefore, this means that, however, if you put the numbers together and you consider how to calculate, the GDP is calculated on a quarterly basis, then the most likely outcome is that the second quarter will be definitely worse than the first quarter of 2020. And the reason is that we essentially, for the first quarter of 2020, the very negative numbers that we have seen for a number of countries were the result essentially of one very negative month, which was March. What we are having for the second quarter is an awful month, which was April. Then we have a month which is going to be negative May, similarly to March. And then we are going to have a month, the final month of the quarter, which is June, not too far from the normal that we were which we were living before, but not quite the same number there. So therefore, there are good reasons to expect a much lower, a much worse negative number for the second quarter in all these economies, with the exception of China, than it has been in the previous quarter. Okay, then I'd like to give you, if I manage to, to move to the next slide, I want to give you some snapshots concerning China, the United States, and Germany. Although we are Italian, Canadian, or Brazilian, I think it's just fair to say that what happens to these three countries is perhaps the most important. These are the most important facts for the geographical areas that surround these countries. So let me start from China briefly. I want to give you some more details in addition to the PMI, to the market PMI, which is a summary number that comes out interviewing purchasing managers. So what the data that we're showing already an improvement from the second half, in the second half of February, relates to coal consumption of power plants and real estate transactions. The data that you see here, they tend to show very bad numbers here. This it was essentially a minus 80% compared to normality would be 1, and instead we have a 0.2. And at the end of December, this number were in excess of some 60% to normality. So therefore, these data are not deseasonalized real estate transactions. There are many transactions that occur at the end of the year. But then you see that this fell essentially to the floor, to almost 20%. But then you also see a recovery towards normality, which occurred during the month of March, which is consistent with the data that we have seen from the market PMI. These data are also pictured and confirmed. So the turnaround is there also for coal consumption. That is also reflected in the recovery of industrial production in March. Industrial production was down by 13 percentage points in January and February compared to before. But then you do see that this has been partly, not fully, but almost fully reabsorbed with a -1%. Industrial production was growing in China by some 5-6 percentage points compared to the previous year. And then here you still have a -1 in March. This is because the major fall in February has still to be reabsorbed. But we do see signs of a recovery in almost completed in April, and I think with much more in May. So essentially for China, it looks like, speaking of industrial production, that the coronavirus is no longer there in terms of the data published for industrial production. Retail sales are instead lagging behind a little bit more compared to industrial production. So it is like saying that consumers are facing hardships that instead production is not facing. This has also to do with the fact that maybe Asia is recovering to with a faster speed than the rest of the world, and so therefore this is benefiting China industrial production more than it does for retail sales, which is more linked to what happens to internal incomes, disposable income, and so on. And so therefore people may be more skeptical about going back to consume as they were doing before. For the United States, the shocking numbers mostly comes from the labor market. We are seeing, I'm showing you two pictures. The one that is very striking for a European is this initial jobless claims. So these are the persons requesting unemployment benefits for the first time in the previous week compared to the week in which these data are declared. The numbers here should be multiplied by 1,000. So if you add them up, it says that overall about 40 million people accumulating the numbers 1 week after the other declare of being in a position of requesting an unemployment benefit for the first time during this period of time. The brunt of the crisis has been suffered seemingly between the end of March and the beginning of April. Then you see that the number of new people, people requesting for the first time this unemployment benefit keeps coming down to about 2 million people after reaching a very high number of bordering 7 million in the week of March the 29th. The numbers that I'm reporting here is instead the unemployment rate. It's almost invisible the amount of time that took in order to go from 3.5 to 15. But it's there, and it's the highest number that is recorded by Trading Economics, which is an aggregator of sources. We cannot go back to the 30s with this picture. In the 30s, the unemployment rate in the US went up to 25% of the labor force. Moreover, at the time, unemployment benefits were not there. So therefore, you can imagine that the social impact of what happened in the 30s has been of a paramount importance, a much bigger importance compared to what we are seeing today. Still, an upward jump of more than 10 percentage points in a month or in 2 months is certainly something that is visible in terms of welfare in the United States everywhere, and will be there for the next few months as well. And then I want to mention also something about Germany, because Germany is so important for Italy. Here I'm reporting some numbers. Before commenting the numbers for GDP, I want to mention something related to the diffusion of the contagion in Germany. Here I'm posting data for Italy. I'm showing you a parallel. So this is Italy and the number of deaths in Italy and the number of deaths in Germany. It seems that there is a convergence, but there's no convergence at all. And the reason is that the German numbers are measured on the right-hand axis, while instead the numbers of Italy are measured on the left-hand axis. So essentially, what we have is that the health emergency, for a variety of reasons that I'm not discussing here, has been definitely less lethal in Germany than it has been in Italy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the quarterly GDP growth in Germany for the first quarter has been a minus 2.2% compared to the previous quarter, and deseasonalizing data, so eliminating the effect of Christmas. So therefore, the data reported here can be compared from one quarter to the other. So they are Q-on-Q growth rates that can be meaningfully compared, because the seasonal component and the calendar differences have been eliminated from the data. The minus 2.2 for Germany compares to data for the euro area as a whole without Germany that shows a minus 5%. So this is saying that indeed the virus has been hitting everybody in Europe. However, there is some evidence that the shock has not been symmetric across countries. So some countries fared better in terms of the health impact of the shock, and also because of in terms of the economic impact of the shock, which may also help us explain why the discussion about the European package has been so heated before coming to the delivery of the so-called recovery fund, or next generation as fund, as is more properly labeled and will be further discussed in the next few weeks. But I think that in order to understand where European governments split and negotiate, it's useful to keep in mind these numbers. So there are differences in terms of the asymmetric effect, health and economic effects of the crisis that we are seeing between the rest of Europe and perhaps Germany and a part of Northern Europe. In any case, also perhaps because of the milder manifestation of the crisis, of the health crisis in Germany, at some point, it was April the 21st, if you go to the southeast part of my slide, Germany allowed car dealerships, car dealers to reopen, as well as assembly lines have been allowed to restart production. So this has been a sign of the fact that the crisis, the health crisis, was considered to be on the way to conclusion. At the same time, even in Germany, pretty much the same as in China, some car dealers had bad surprises. So they had, the car dealers were there waiting for their customers, but in practice, some of them were making statements such as the one that I found in a Fortune article. Nobody has come by this morning. Therefore, as they reopen, the great reopening will take time. A specific example of numbers that I remember was one of these car dealers. They were used to receive something like 50 people visiting during the morning their shop to ask questions about cars, this model, the other model, and so on. And instead, they had 15 rather than 50. So therefore, this gives a rough order of magnitude of something like 1/3 of what was normal was taking place at the time. So this is in itself already telling us that the return to normality is actually will take some time. And moreover, there are another couple of things to consider. First is what's going to happen to public debt, whether public debt will become unsustainable or not. So let's look at some other data. For sure, what we are having is that in 2020, I'm here using European Commission data because they are more easily comparable, and they also include data for 2021, which were not included for some countries by the IMF. So we are having a skyrocketing budget deficit. If we have in mind that 3% is the iron rule for the budget deficit in the euro area, well, we should forget about this. The budget deficit for 2020 is going to be 8.5, which will average out a lower budget deficit, surprise, surprise, for Germany, but still high, 7%. And then a much higher budget deficit for Italy, 11%, and 10% for France. In the US, the expected budget deficit is going to be in the order of 18 percentage points. Then for 2021, we are having instead that at least a large fraction of this will be reabsorbed. You see that for the euro area, the budget deficit is expected to come down to 3.5%. Once again, averaging out differences, cross-country differences between Germany and, I'm taking Italy and France as the other side, the other spectrum, the other end of the spectrum. The differences in budget deficit will be reflected in differences in public debt, which, however, will not be reabsorbed as easily as done for the budget deficit. You see that as a result of the crisis, essentially the public debt as a share of GDP will be permanently higher of some 10 percentage point or more for the euro area. Same for Germany, 20 percentage point for Italy, and something in between for France. And we do see something like a plus 25 percentage point for the United States, 131. The question is whether this means that we are going to see public debt as unsustainability for the future. The answer is I don't think so, mostly because the increase in the budget deficit is mostly temporary, because it comes mostly from temporary hikes in emergency-related government spending. So the expectation is that government spending will pop up by some 8 percentage points in the euro area from 47 to 55, which is, if you go back to my data in the previous slide, there's an increase of 8 percentage points for the euro area and budget deficit. And this has to do with the explosion of government spending due to emergency, which is expected to be almost entirely reabsorbed. So therefore, it is expected to fade away. Therefore, I expect that financial markets will be ready to look into this data and understand that the explosion of government spending will be reabsorbed. The increase of public debt is not the result of some irresponsible fiscal policy on the part of individual European countries, because this applies to other countries as well in the rest of the world. The important thing is that interest rates remain low, and they are going to be kept low by central banks for a long period of time. So therefore, there's no real reason to be particularly worried, not even for a country like Italy, just because the temporariness of the worsening of the budget deficit data is there, is easily understood. So therefore, if the Italian government behaves wisely, so therefore if they channel government spending to the uses that we will be committing to, there's no reason ex ante to be particularly worried about repaying 160 percentage point of GDP as opposed to 135. That would be the general point. And indeed, stocks restarted early on, by and large in the second half of March. Here I'm reporting data for Standard & Poor's 500, the Euro Stocks 50, which is the index for the Euro area, the common index for the Euro area. But you also see a turnaround for Canada and also for Brazil. Somehow the turnaround has been more substantial for the data reported on the left-hand side of the slide, which includes the US and Canada, and less so for Europe and Brazil, which is also consistent with the expectation that the recovery will be perhaps less pronounced in Brazil and some countries of the Euro area, particularly Italy. In Italy, we have a recovery of 30%, while the German DAX recouped 55%. Then we have the Bovespa, so the stock market index for Brazil, recovered to an extent that is similar to Italy rather than to Germany, generally speaking. But the big piece of news here is that you see that markets essentially have become bullish again. So they don't see any, they're not worried about the Chinese-US Cold War. So for now, they are seeing brighter prospects and they're seeing the green shoots I was mentioning before, and they tend to overweight these green shoots compared to any other news in the data. Finally, I think I spoke a lot, but then let me give you some the reason to be potentially worried. So what can go wrong? Well, the risk of a second wave that you were mentioning before. Let me take the data for Hong Kong, not because of the other reason for why Hong Kong is making the headlines these days, but because of a more subtle aspect. So Hong Kong had a second wave already since mid-March, but the numbers of new cases are very small. They remain low for Hong Kong, but they still had an experience with SARS. So therefore, when somehow they were ready, they tackled well the crisis and the virus when this showed up. But then they had a second wave, and therefore the question is important for us is why has the second wave been around? And essentially the points are there: too low distancing, too fast return to normal shopping, and also COVID-19 has been mostly reimported from overseas returning citizens. So therefore, this is a reason to be relatively cautious with the reopening up of borders. But I would say that this would be problematic if this comes coupled with a too fast return to normal shopping. If we adopt rules that are cautious rules in our everyday lives, then I'm not particularly worried about the reopening of borders as long as everybody respects distancing, the wearing of masks, and other measures that authorities typically are suggesting. So that was it on my side, I would say. I can maybe stop sharing my screen, and I'm ready to take other questions if they are there, if I haven't killed you with too many slides and boredom. Everybody's silent. Oh, there's a question, two questions. Okay, I will not repeat the elogi. Alberto from Como Lake, you mentioned that as long as interest rates are low and national debt does not rise because of unwise spending, there is no reason to worry. Realistically speaking, the EU money for the Italian recovery will never arrive, or maybe it will arrive too late or with too many conditions attached. Does Italy risk a default on its debt, or is Italy a country too big to fail that will eventually recover? And then the other question from Andrea, do you see a chance of inflation raising? Okay, let me take the two questions. They are very important questions, so let me give you my perception and my perspective. Seemingly markets tend to share my view that somehow Italy is not, for the time being, risking a default. It's true that presumably the mountain of money that the EU is preparing for the next few years is probably good for the next EU generation, rather than for to cure the consequences of the current crisis. At the same time, however, the EU is doing many things for Italy already. They are buying our government debt, not according to the capital keys. During these months, capital keys is the share of Italy in the ECB capital, which is something in the order of 17%. Now the share of the share of purchases on the part of the European Central Bank that goes to Italian debt is higher than this, in the order of 20%. But at the same time, during the first few months of this year, they were buying less than 17%. So we have to judge over time. But generally speaking, the point is the ECB is there. At the beginning, Ms. Lagarde made the wrong statement saying that the ECB is not involved with closing spreads. This has a part of truth, but it's not the entire story. So therefore, we don't expect the chairman of the ECB to be so non-cautious to mention a statement like this. But then she, with her actions, she adjusted pretty much. So therefore, she was able to put together 750 billion of flow of liquidity available to buy out government bonds, including Italian government bonds. Second, the other point, which is more of a political thing, is Europe has provided other funds which should be available before 2021, which is instead the next generation money. And then, but then we have the so-called MES, so the bailout fund available there. This fund has been, so the conditions with which the money from this source were supposed to come in the past, they have been dismantled. We would be giving, we would be receiving money for like 2 percentage points of GDP to carry out the health spending that we would be supposed to do anyway, in order to reinforce the resilience of our healthcare system. Particularly here in Lombardy, I think we realized that our healthcare system was okay for normal times, but not for emergency times. So therefore, we had to strengthen this resilience to emergency, and so therefore we will need money as well. So therefore, the money coming from the bailout fund, for the European bailout funds, would be useful for this purpose. So I don't see this as a very constraining condition. Is actually something that would be a good thing for us to be kept in mind. The other thing is that there would be co-financing of the money that we spend to assist our hidden unemployed people, which are called people in cassa integrazione, so with an income support schemes. So therefore, Europe is doing a lot for us. And also, I wouldn't disregard the importance of having money even for 2021. When the money becomes available, it might be that we have a second wave to deal with. So therefore, it would be very valuable to have additional sources of money when the time comes. So therefore, I still consider this to be to make a picture which is overall a picture which doesn't make Italy the bad guy in Europe, at least I would say for the time being. And moreover, I also see the current situation as very different from the situation in which government spreads went up back in 2012 and the end of 2011. This was a time in which the political mood in Europe was very different. Now we have a German president of the European Commission. We have a French president of the ECB. So this means the two most important countries in Europe are there to lead the dance. And so therefore, this means also that Germany and France are in charge, which is a very powerful reassurance with respect to financial markets that Europe is here to stay, and is here to stay with Italy and Spain and other countries as well. So I think that's important. Concerning inflation, I don't see inflation to be a real, to be very likely. Inflation essentially shows up not so much because of monetary injections, because in crisis times, money is there and remains parked somewhere in banks, balance sheets in most cases. So therefore, it's difficult to think of inflation as being with us anytime soon, unless we have that for some reason OPEC manages to agree on production cuts much more substantial than what we have seen in the past few weeks and months. So if you see the data for inflation rate and oil prices, they go hand in hand like fiancé. So that's the only determinant of inflation that we see as important. There are other forces that tend to keep inflation low, the Amazon effect and the China effect. So it's true that Chinese wages kept going up a little bit, but then in practice, even productivity went up. So therefore, it's very difficult to think of importing inflation from higher prices in China. And at the same time, we also have the Amazon effect, which tends to suggest everybody to keep inflation low in the retail industry. And if it stays low in the retail industry, even for the other industries, then inflation stays low. So I don't see inflation as being high, nowhere high than 1% anywhere in most areas of the world, which is also bad news for those countries who have to repay public debt, because otherwise inflation helps a little bit. So some 2-3% of inflation would help. We may be back to that. There might be also more tolerance of higher than 2% inflation in the next few years, but not for now, not for the next year. Then the assumptions seem to be reasonable, but from an anonymous attendee. The assumptions seem to be reasonable but optimistic, I would say. Is there any data presentation you are working on that may show a bit more realistic scenario? In a history of pandemics, there was always a second wave, and currently the second wave of COVID-19 is expected sometime in the fall. What is your take on it, as your assumptions are based on slow but gradual recovery with minimal obstacles on the way? My point is, even if there is a second wave, then we are in a better conditions, because this first wave has been very close to us. And moreover, I think that we learned something from the first wave. So therefore, I expect to be some storage of intensive care units to be made by countries. That's the purpose for carrying out more government spending plans. So therefore, even if a second wave comes, we would be in a better position. Moreover, yesterday I listened to Professor Fauci's presentation. Professor Fauci is the physician that I trust more, and he is expecting to see a vaccine to be available by the end of this year. So therefore, in case a vaccine becomes available, then problems will be less serious. Clearly, there may be a next pandemic, but now we learned that pandemics are important. So therefore, I think there will be more caution in good times in order to set aside a little bit of resources for the next pandemic, which may show up from a different source. Frankly, before this crisis, from time to time, I ask myself where I would be expecting sort of a black swan, and certainly the pandemic that we have seen, frankly, took me by surprise. I must admit, I was not the only one, I think, taken by surprise. But instead, I would be expecting something like more a terrorist attack on the internet, or maybe power on some sort of power plant production, particularly important for I don't know, disruption in supplies of electricity supplies, because electricity is, speaking of necessary things, this is certainly one of the things that I would be expecting. So therefore, that's the reason for my optimism, which, however, I consider a mild optimism. So I don't consider this a silly optimism, because this wouldn't make sense. It's true that for some reason I must be optimistic, because I'm trying to convince people to come over and be here at Bocconi and taking their MBA. So obviously I'm here, and by nature almost I'm supposed to be optimistic, but as an economist I tend to be mildly I consider the numbers I reported you as being mildly optimistic, and I suggest you take a serious look at this monthly data that I was showing you only briefly. There are more of them, but then typically stock markets are good predictors of what's going to happen, not all the time, but in most times. And instead, in terms of snapshots, the market PMIs are, I think, useful data to consider. Oh, there are other questions. In countries with low propensity to save, such as Brazil, can there be a problem of default in the payment of public debt? Mauro Mantica. Well, more than in Italy, for sure. We have a very high saving rate, and instead Brazil is less favored in this respect. The favorable element of Brazil is that Brazil is very rich on natural resources. So therefore, in case the world economy goes back to growth, then even the prices of exported raw materials from Brazil, like sugar cane, coffee, and these things, then they would go up, and therefore even for Brazil, public debt would become more sustainable, as long as the Brazilian politicians don't engage, as they at times have done in the past, in more government spending together with higher raw material prices. Raw material prices tend to fluctuate, so therefore it would be important to be more cautious in raising spending only in a sustainable way. Easier said than done for all governments. Elena asked me whether I can comment on a possible increase of taxation. Well, a little bit of increase of taxation will show up eventually, unless we want to cut other items of government spending. This applies to everything else, to every country in the world, but not for now. So therefore, I don't expect to see higher taxes in Italy anytime soon, higher taxes in the US anytime soon, in the UK, anywhere. I don't expect this to be part of the story. Then when things will readjust to a more normal situation, then there would be questions to be raised. Shall we want to keep government spending high or not? In case we want to keep this high for a number of very good reasons, in order to assist the poor, in order to provide the necessary funding for healthcare, many other reasons, then we have to decide whether we want to cut other items of unnecessary or less necessary government spending. But typically this list tends to be very short when the time comes. So therefore, some increase in taxation will be almost unavoidable. And so therefore, this is something to consider. The name of my cat, I have two cats. Poldo, because he's there, okay. Poldo is here, I can grab him. He tends to be an example of a fat cat, so like 7 kilos. And then I have, yes. And then I have Pesca. She's my favorite. She's she's very hungry now, so it's difficult to grab her. So Pesca and Poldo.
So thank you, Francesco. Thank you for this interesting lecture. I think now we can we close here. If you have more questions, please send them to our alumni address, and we will readdress them to the professor.
No, but you can send me the questions directly. Okay. Of course, if you want to go through it, that's fine. That's fine. But then otherwise, just send me the email to Bocconi and so on. Okay.
Fantastic. That's great. Thank you. Thank you to the Istituto of Cultura as well for hosting us again, this time digitally. Thanks all of you for attending. So we will send out the presentation. So thanks, Francesco, for allowing us. And also we will publish on the website of the Istituto and also on our social the recording that we did today. Please remember that we go on. So we have another session next week talking about careers planning. So let's stay connected and have a good day or have a good night.